My name is Harold Ellison, and at 76 years of age I find myself speaking into a silence that grows deeper with every year, a silence that fills the corners of my modest one-bedroom house at the edge of Des Moines and echoes even in the smallest of sounds, the scrape of a chair, the creak of the floorboards, the drip of the kitchen faucet I keep meaning to fix, but never do, because in a strange way that steady drip is a reminder that something in this house still moves, still responds, still insists on being noticed. I live alone now, not by choice but by the merciless arithmetic of time that steals companions and scatters family across distances that are not only measured in miles but in priorities, ambitions, and the stubborn egos of those who once promised loyalty in the glow of wedding photographs and childhood laughter. My wife, Marianne, passed 8 years ago in early spring, and since then I have not been able to think of lilacs without the bitter aftertaste of loss, because she adored them and planted 3 bushes in the yard that now bloom faithfully each April, even though she is not here to see them, and every year I stand in front of them, wondering why flowers manage to keep their promise while people do not. I spend my mornings in a routine that to anyone else might look painfully uneventful, but to me has become a shield against collapse. I rise before dawn, not out of necessity but because sleep has become a stingy companion, and I make coffee the way Marianne liked it, boiled longer than most would tolerate, with a pinch of salt that she always swore brought out the flavor. I drink it slowly at the kitchen table that has been mine alone for nearly a decade, though I still set down 2 cups as if one might be claimed by an invisible guest. And while I know this gesture is half superstition and half denial, I cannot break it. After breakfast, I read the paper, cover to cover, though the news makes me restless, the names of politicians and cities and tragedies sliding through my mind without sticking. But I persist because it is what Marianne and I used to do together. The rest of the day is a blur of small maintenance tasks and long hours of staring out the window at the street where children once played tag until the streetlights came on, the same street where my own son used to ride his bicycle, the sound of his laughter a bright thing that cut through the humid summer air. That boy is now 50, a man with a mortgage, 2 children in college, and a voice that carries less warmth than an automated answering machine. His name is Richard, though in my mind he is still Ricky, the boy who once refused to eat his peas unless I pretended to be a truck delivering them across the table into his mouth, the boy who used to curl up on the couch between Marianne and me when thunderstorms rattled the windows, asking us if the house would fall apart. I used to tell him that no house built with love could ever fall, but now I sometimes wonder if I lied, or if love has simply been repainted into something unrecognizable, something transactional, something cold. It is not that my son has abandoned me outright. He calls occasionally, visits when his wife insists, and every Thanksgiving I am invited to their large suburban home, where I sit at the edge of conversations that whirl around me like a foreign language. But the connection is fragile, more ritual than affection. His wife, Julia, is efficient, polite, always ready with a brittle smile that seems to say, "You are here because decency demands it, not because we want you." I have tried to be grateful even for that, because I know many men my age sit in nursing homes with no visitors at all, their names forgotten even by their grandchildren. But gratitude is a slippery emotion when the eyes of your own family skim over you as if you were already fading into the wallpaper. The house I live in holds reminders of who I once was, though I confess I sometimes no longer recognize that man. There are photo albums on the shelf, thick with fading Polaroids of summer barbecues, camping trips by the river, and Christmas mornings where the children tore into presents, while Marianne and I watched with a joy that seemed limitless, as if life had locked itself into an endless upward arc. Those albums are heavy to look through now, Each page feels like a weight pressing against my chest. Still, I open them sometimes in the evenings when the television hums with programs I barely follow, and I trace my finger over the faces of my grandchildren when they were toddlers, remembering the sticky hugs, the way they mispronounced my name as Poppy. They are grown now, both in universities on the East Coast, and I have not seen them in more than 2 years, though I dutifully send Christmas checks and birthday cards, which are acknowledged by brief text messages. Thanks, Grandpa. Love. I tell myself that is enough, that children grow busy, that distance explains everything, but deep down I know indifference has a sharper edge than geography. I am not entirely without company. The neighbors wave when they see me, though younger ones do not know my name, and sometimes I exchange a few words with the cashier at the grocery store, who always asks if I am finding everything all right. I smile and say yes, though the truth is that I have not been finding anything all right for years. Loneliness at this age is not dramatic. It is not weeping in the night or shouting at the walls. It is quieter, subtler, a gradual erosion that leaves you unsure of whether the person you used to be still exists. Sometimes I wonder if I am invisible already, a shadow moving through routines while the world forgets to notice. Yet I still believe in dignity. I dress neatly each morning even if no one will see me, polish my shoes before going out, comb what little hair I have left, because Marianne always told me that respect begins with how you present yourself. She used to say, "Harold, a man who stops caring how he looks stops caring who he is." And I have clung to that sentence like a rope over a widening chasm. I think about it especially when I am around Richard and Julia, because though their words cut, their eyes scan me as if measuring when I will finally collapse into the role of a helpless old man they can quietly sideline. I resist that collapse every day, even if it is only in the way I hold a fork or the way I keep my posture straight when sitting alone at my table. I had imagined once that old age would bring a kind of serene authority, that children would look to me as a repository of wisdom, that grandchildren would crowd around for stories, that family dinners would be anchored by my presence. Instead, I have become the man who waits by the phone for invitations that may not come, who cooks single portions of stew and eats them slowly, who hears laughter through the walls of neighbors' houses and feels like a ghost haunting the periphery. Of other people's happiness, I know this sounds bitter, and perhaps it is, but bitterness is born from disappointment, and disappointment from hope. I had hoped for more, and though I have learned to temper my expectations, I cannot extinguish the memory of what once was. This, then, is where I stand at the beginning of the story I am about to tell. A man not broken, not yet defeated, but pressed against the edges of invisibility, holding on to dignity with hands that tremble, but do not release, waiting for a moment. Any moment when life will ask me to prove that I am still here. It was on a grey afternoon in late November, the kind of afternoon when the air feels too heavy for its own weight, and the light slants through the windows in a way that makes everything in the house look older than it already is, that the telephone rang with a call that set in motion the chain of events I had not expected, but which in hindsight had been waiting for me all along. I was sitting at the table, a half-finished crossword puzzle in front of me, the sort of distraction I never solved completely because my patience frayed before the clues gave up their secrets, when the familiar name appeared on the caller ID, Richard Ellison. My son's name, the boy who used to tug on my sleeve for advice, the man who now rarely called unless something required my signature or my presence, and still as the phone rang, I felt a surge of something dangerously close to hope, because there is no cure for the father's instinct to believe that a son's call means inclusion rather than obligation. I answered with the cautious warmth of someone who knows that too much enthusiasm will embarrass the caller. Richard's voice was brisk, not unfriendly, but tight with the efficiency of a man checking off an item on his list. He said, "Dad, Julia and I thought you might want to come over for dinner this weekend. We'll have the kids home from college, and it might be nice for everyone to be together." I paused, though only for a breath, to let the words sink in, because invitations like that had become rare, and the thought of sitting at a table with my grandchildren, grown now, but still in my mind the same children who once played in my backyard while Marianne served lemonade, was enough to make me forget the quiet suspicion that always accompanied such offers. I said yes, of course, and my voice trembled slightly as I asked what time. Richard said 6, and then, almost as an afterthought, "It's nothing fancy, just a family meal," as though he needed to reassure me that no ceremony was required, though in truth I would have shown up in my funeral suit if that had been the condition, because for me the event was not about food, but about being allowed into their lives for an evening. When I hung up the phone, I sat in the stillness of the house for a long while, staring at the crossword grid that now seemed ridiculous in its small frustrations compared to the sudden swell of purpose filling me. I thought about what to wear, about the gift I should bring, wine perhaps, though Julia rarely drank, or a box of chocolates, though the grandchildren were too old for such tokens. And I found myself rehearsing casual remarks, questions about their classes, their friends, anything that might remind them that their grandfather still listened and cared. It is humiliating in a way to admit how much preparation I invested into that simple dinner, but anyone who has been starved of belonging knows that the smallest crumb of attention is treated like a feast. Saturday arrived with a sharp chill in the air and a sky the colour of slate. I polished my shoes, pressed the shirt that Marianne had once said brought out the colour in my eyes, and set out on the short drive to Richard's house, a place I had contributed money toward years earlier when he and Julia insisted they needed help, with the down payment, promising that the home would always be open to me. That promise had worn thin quickly, visits growing sporadic, the warmth evaporating into politeness. Yet the house still felt in part mine because of the sacrifice it had cost me. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw the large windows glowing with light, silhouettes moving inside, and for a moment I let myself imagine that this was the return of something long dormant, that tonight I would not be a guest but a father and grandfather welcomed without calculation. Julia opened the door before I rang the bell, her smile stretched across her face like a curtain drawn quickly to conceal whatever lies behind. She said, "Harold, glad you could make it," and kissed the air near my cheek, guiding me inside with the smooth efficiency of a hostess, trained in good manners but not genuine warmth. The house smelled of roasted meat and herbs, the kind of smell that reaches into a man's memory and stirs hunger, not only of the stomach but of the heart. I shrugged off my coat, handed her the bottle of wine I had chosen after too much deliberation, and was led into the living room where my son stood with a glass in hand. Richard clapped me on the shoulder, said, "Dad, good to see you," and introduced me once more to my own grandchildren, as if time had stretched so far that we were strangers needing ceremony to bridge the gap. They looked taller, older, their faces sharpened by youth that had crossed into adulthood, and I felt both pride and the sting of distance. We made small talk, the kind that clatters around the edges of true intimacy without ever landing, and then Julia announced that dinner was ready. We moved into the dining room, a long polished table, set with more formality than Richard's words on the phone had implied, crystal glasses and heavy silverware gleaming under the chandelier. I felt a flicker of awe, followed by a pang of nervousness, because in such settings every gesture, every misstep seems magnified. I was about to take my seat when Richard's voice cut through the clamour of chairs being moved. He said, casually but with an edge that I could not ignore, "Dad, maybe you'd be more comfortable eating in the kitchen. It's quieter there, less crowded." For a moment I did not understand, thinking I had misheard him, but Julia's quick nod confirmed that he meant exactly what I feared. The words landed not as a suggestion but as a verdict, delivered with the subtle firmness of someone trying to disguise cruelty as concern. The grandchildren looked down at their plates, and in that silence I felt the heat rise in my face. I laughed softly, hoping to turn it into a joke, but no one joined me. Instead, Julia added, "You know, sometimes it's easier for you when things are calmer, isn't it, Harold?" She said it in the same tone one might use with a child who is prone to tantrums. My instinct was to protest, to insist on my place at the table, but decades of habit, of not wanting to spoil an evening, of yielding for the sake of peace, pushed me into obedience. I nodded, muttered something about not minding, and walked into the kitchen with my plate, trying to hold my back straight as if it were my own decision. The kitchen was bright, sterile, the counter already stacked with serving dishes, the hum of the refrigerator my only company. They placed a chair for me near the corner, a chair that did not match the set from the dining room, as if it had been pulled hastily from storage. I sat there, alone, but within earshot of the laughter and conversation drifting from the dining room, the voices of my family threading through the doorway like music from a party to which I had not been invited. I ate slowly, each bite tasting of salt and humiliation, and though I tried to focus on the food, I could not ignore the fact that I was a man exiled in his own bloodline's house. The minutes stretched. I caught snippets of dialogue. Richard discussing work, Julia laughing too loudly, the grandchildren talking about their classes, and none of it included me. I was invisible, and worse, I had accepted invisibility as if it were natural. When Julia finally came into the kitchen with a polite smile, asking if everything was fine, I answered yes, though the truth sat in my chest like a stone. She refilled my glass of water and returned to the others, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving me in the corner with nothing but the steady ticking of the wall clock and the gnawing realization that something had shifted permanently in the landscape of my life. When at last the evening ended, when goodbyes were exchanged at the door and Richard hugged me with the quickness of a man impatient to resume his own comfort, I stepped out into the night air and felt the cold slice through me. Driving home, the streets blurred by headlights, I told myself that perhaps I had misinterpreted, that perhaps they truly meant it as kindness, but the lie did not hold. Deep inside, I knew the truth. The son I once carried on my shoulders now carried me only as a burden, and the table I had once imagined as the anchor of family had become a place where I no longer belonged. The days that followed that dinner stretched out like a dull ache, the kind of ache that you cannot ignore because it is woven into every movement, every thought, and every small ritual you perform to convince yourself that life has not already closed its doors on you. And though I told myself repeatedly that perhaps I had overreacted, perhaps Richard and Julia had only meant to spare me the noise and commotion of the larger table, I could not rid myself of the image of myself sitting alone. In that bright kitchen, a figure exiled not by accident, but by deliberate orchestration. I replayed the moment again and again. Richard's casual words, Julia's confirming smile, the way my grandchildren looked down at their plates instead of meeting my eyes. And the more I thought of it, the more it seemed that the decision to remove me from the center had not been born in that instant, but had been building slowly in their minds until the moment when it could be spoken without shame. For several nights afterward, I walked the rooms of my small house in a kind of restless haze, unable to sleep, touching the frames of photographs on the walls as though they might whisper back to me some forgotten reassurance. Yet all they gave me were frozen smiles from decades past, reminders of a family that seemed to have been buried along with Marianne. I thought of her often during those nights, her voice steadying me when I had doubts, her insistence that dignity is not something given by others, but something you must protect yourself. And I felt ashamed that I had allowed myself to be pushed into the kitchen like a harmless piece of furniture to be moved aside. It gnawed at me, the realization that I had gone quietly, that I had accepted humiliation under the guise of keeping the peace. And the more I reflected, the more determined I became that if the moment presented itself again, I would not retreat so easily. So when another call came, this time a week later, inviting me once again for dinner on Sunday evening, I accepted without hesitation, though in my heart I resolved that the evening would not follow the same script. The conversation on the phone was brief, Richard's tone clipped, Julia's voice in the background reminding him to tell me the time. And though there was no special warmth in the invitation, I told myself that perhaps they were making an effort, perhaps the last dinner had simply been mishandled. Yet beneath that fragile hope, there was a deeper current of steel. I would not sit in the kitchen again, not while I still had breath in my body and memory in my mind. When Sunday came, I dressed carefully but not extravagantly, choosing clothes that were neat and modest, a reflection of my generation's belief that respect begins with how you present yourself. And as I drove to their house, I rehearsed in my head the calm firmness with which I would take my seat at the table. The driveway was crowded with cars, some belonging to neighbors, some to Julia's friends. And when I entered the house, the noise of conversation and clinking glasses told me that tonight was larger than just family. Julia greeted me with her usual polished smile, though her eyes flicked briefly with something harder, and Richard, distracted by his guests, gave me a perfunctory hug before steering me toward the dining room, where the long table gleamed under the chandelier once more. I walked slowly to the head of the table, the place traditionally reserved for the elder of the family, the place I had once occupied without question when Marianne was alive, and when Richard was still young enough to defer to my authority. There was a moment of hesitation, a pause in the flow of conversation as people noticed where I was heading, and then Julia, with a sweetness too sharp to be sincere, said, "Dad, maybe you'd prefer a quieter spot again." Her voice lilted upward at the end as though it were a question, but her eyes held the firmness of a command. My heart thudded, but I kept my posture straight and said, "No, I'll sit here," pulling out the chair at the head of the table and lowering myself into it with deliberate calm. The silence that followed was brief but heavy, broken finally by the shuffle of guests adjusting themselves, by Richard clearing his throat and forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace, and by Julia clattering plates onto the table with more force than necessary. I sat there, not defiant exactly, but resolved, my hands steady on the tablecloth, my eyes meeting theirs without flinching, and I felt a small surge of something I had not felt in a long time. Control, however fragile. Dinner began. The dishes passed around with stiff hands, the conversation strained, and though Julia tried to dominate the flow with chatter about recipes and neighbors, I noticed the way her jaw tightened every time she glanced at me. Richard, for his part, kept his voice level but short, answering questions directed at him without embellishment, as if conserving energy for an argument yet to come. The grandchildren, caught in the tension, remained unusually quiet, pushing food around their plates, occasionally sneaking glances at me, as if unsure whether to feel pity or admiration. I tried to speak to them, to ask about their studies, their lives, but Julia cut across my words with sudden changes of subject, and I realized with a sinking clarity that I was not meant to be part of the conversation at all, only tolerated as a figure who had claimed more space than he was allotted. Still, I remained in my seat, and each minute that passed without me being removed felt like a small victory. Yet victories of that sort are double-edged, for the resentment they generate does not vanish. It sharpens quietly in the eyes of those who feel their authority challenged. At one point, Richard leaned slightly toward Julia and whispered something I could not hear, and though their voices were low, I caught fragments. Stubborn? Embarrassing? Not safe. And I felt my face burn, though I kept my expression neutral. Julia responded in the same low tone, her eyes flicking toward me before narrowing. And in that instant I understood. They were not merely annoyed by my presence at the head of the table. They were plotting a narrative in which my insistence on dignity could be reframed as evidence of decline. The meal dragged on, each course an ordeal of strained politeness, until at last dessert was served and people began to shift restlessly, eager to be free of the heavy air. I stood when they stood, shook hands when expected, smiled when required, but inside I was seething with the realization that this was no longer a family dinner but a battleground, subtle but merciless, in which I was being tested for weakness. As I drove home that night, the streets empty and dark, I knew with certainty that the line had been crossed. What had begun as a casual suggestion in the tone of concern had hardened into a campaign to push me aside, to make me small, to transform me from father into burden. And though fear gnawed at me, fear of being truly powerless, I also felt a new fire building in my chest, the determination that the next stage of this battle would not find me unprepared. In the days after that second dinner, when I had chosen to remain at the head of the table despite their silent disapproval, I carried with me a strange combination of pride and unease, for although I had stood my ground and refused to be banished into the shadows of the kitchen once more, I also understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that my resistance had not gone unnoticed and that it would not be forgiven, and the atmosphere within Richard's household would only grow colder as a result. I had begun to sense, in every pause of conversation and every calculated glance exchanged between my son and his wife, that my insistence on dignity was being twisted into something else, something darker, as though they were quietly preparing a case against me in which stubbornness could be redefined as senility and defiance could be mistaken for confusion. It was not one moment alone that made this suspicion form, but rather a series of subtle exchanges. Julia placing her hand on Richard's arm when I spoke, as though signaling him to ignore me. Richard sighing audibly whenever I tried to contribute to her discussions about the grandchildren, the way they both seemed to avoid eye contact when I mentioned memories of the past, as if those memories were inconvenient evidence they would rather erase. The turning point came one evening when I visited unannounced, an act I had not dared in years, but loneliness pushed me out of my own house and into the car, telling myself that perhaps spontaneity might rekindle some of the natural ease families once shared before calendars and obligations fenced us all in. When Julia opened the door, surprise flickered across her face, quickly replaced by a thin smile, and she said, "Of course I could come in," though her voice carried that brittle quality that made me feel like an unwelcome guest. I entered the living room to find Richard on the phone, his back turned, his voice sharp in argument with someone I could not hear, and though he lowered his tone when he realized I was there, I caught enough to know that the conversation had been about me. Words like doctor's evaluation and memory lapses floated in the air like poisoned dust, and when he ended the call abruptly and turned with a forced cheerfulness, I already knew that my suspicion had solidified into fact. They were considering measures to classify me not as father or grandfather, but as liability, a man to be managed rather than respected. That night, as we sat at the table for a casual meal hastily prepared, Julia spoke with exaggerated slowness, asking me if I remembered the names of certain neighbors from years ago, whether I could recall the recipe for a dish Marianne used to cook, and each question was framed with such feigned innocence that anyone else might have missed the test hidden within it. But I knew. When I answered clearly, providing details that only I could know, Julia smiled too brightly, and Richard muttered something about how "it's good he has good days." My fork froze midway to my mouth. Good days. The implication was unmistakable. They were building a narrative in which my lucidity was temporary, my presence unreliable, and in that moment I realized that my fight was no longer about where I sat during dinner, but about whether I would be allowed to retain control over my own life at all. The realization struck me like a thunderclap, and though outwardly I forced myself to remain calm, inwardly I felt something harden, a resolve that I had not known I still possessed. I began to observe them more closely, to listen not only to what they said but to what they avoided saying, to notice the way Richard always steered conversations toward the idea of security, how Julia emphasized the importance of planning for the future, and how their eyes gleamed with a kind of restrained impatience whenever financial matters were mentioned. I knew then that the humiliations at the table had not been accidents or careless moments of thoughtlessness, but deliberate maneuvers designed to shrink me down, to convince everyone, including myself, that I was already fading, a man whose place could be rearranged like furniture. Driving home later that evening, the streets washed in the cold glow of streetlights. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, aware that my age showed in the stiffness of my hands, but also aware that my mind was still sharp, my memory intact, and my dignity unbroken. The midpoint of my struggle had been reached, and though fear lingered like a shadow in every thought, fear of being declared incompetent, of being stripped of the authority to decide where I lived or how I spent the final years of my life, I also felt the flame of defiance burn more steadily than it had in decades. I knew without doubt that the next time they tried to move me, whether to the kitchen, to the margins of conversation, or eventually to the sterile corridors of a nursing home, I would not step quietly aside. For the first time in years, I was not merely reacting to neglect, but preparing to resist it. And though I was one man against the tightening circle of my own blood, I understood that survival at this age is not measured in years added to a calendar, but in the preservation of one's right to remain whole in the face of those who would rather see you diminished. The weeks that followed that unsettling dinner were filled with a peculiar tension that seemed to thrum beneath the surface of every interaction I had with Richard and Julia, a tension that could be felt in the inflection of their words, in the slight pauses before they answered my questions, in the way they exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking, and though outwardly they maintained the veneer of civility, I knew with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from a lifetime of reading people that a plan was taking shape, one in which my role was being rewritten against my will. I found myself increasingly aware of how carefully they were observing me, how Julia seemed to hover in conversations with her head tilted just slightly, as if cataloguing my words for evidence of confusion, and how Richard would occasionally repeat my own statements back to me as though to test whether I recognized them. What might have seemed like the ordinary fussing of adult children around an aging parent revealed itself, to my sharpened instincts, as something far more insidious, an effort to construct a narrative that I was slipping, that I was incapable of, managing myself, that I was a man in need of guardianship. The realization sank deeper one afternoon when I received an envelope in the mail, a piece of correspondence I almost dismissed as junk until I noticed the return address of a medical practice I did not recognize. Inside was an appointment reminder, my name printed clearly on the top, followed by a date and time for a comprehensive cognitive assessment. I stared at the paper for a long time, the letters blurring until I had to set it down, my hands trembling. With a mixture of anger and disbelief, I had not made this appointment. I had not requested such an evaluation. When I called the number listed, The receptionist cheerfully confirmed that my son had scheduled it on my behalf, explaining that it was common for families to take initiative in these matters. My voice was steady when I cancelled it, but inside my chest there was a storm, the unmistakable confirmation that Richard and Julia were preparing to challenge not only my dignity, but my autonomy, laying the groundwork to have me declared incompetent under the law. The betrayal was sharper than any I had felt before, for it was no longer about where I sat at the dinner table or whether my contributions to conversation were welcomed. It was about control, about erasing my ability to make decisions about my own life, about stripping me of the authority I had spent decades earning. I thought back to the sacrifices I had made, the years of double shifts to pay for Richard's education, the money I had provided when he and Julia wanted their house, the quiet pride with which I had watched him grow into a man I thought would carry forward not only my name, but also the values I had tried to teach him. And now that same son was preparing to argue before strangers in sterile offices that his father no longer knew what he was doing, that he was a burden to be managed rather than a man to be respected. The escalation was not confined to paperwork and hidden appointments. Subtle humiliations began to multiply, as if they were rehearsals for the case against me. At dinners, Julia would interrupt me to correct details of stories, claiming I had misremembered events, though I knew with painful clarity that I was right. If I said a holiday had been in Michigan, she would smile and say it had been in Wisconsin, looking around the table for agreement, and Richard would nod indulgently as though humoring a confused old man. When I mentioned the year Marianne and I had purchased our first car, Richard countered with another date, one that was clearly wrong, but spoken with such authority that the grandchildren accepted it. Each correction was small in isolation, but together they formed a pattern, an attempt to paint me as unreliable to undermine the foundation of memory on which my authority rested. There were moments, too, when Julia's mask slipped, when irritation sharpened her tone and revealed the contempt beneath. One evening, as she cleared the dishes, I offered to help, and she laughed in a way that stung more than any outright insult, saying, "No, Harold, it's better if you just sit." We wouldn't want any accidents. The implication was clear. I was not only unwelcome, but unsafe, a liability in my own family's home. I swallowed the humiliation, but inside I kept a careful ledger, recording each slight, each manipulation, each attempt to turn me into a caricature of decline. The grandchildren, caught in the middle, seemed uneasy. My granddaughter would sometimes linger in conversation with me, asking about Marianne, or about the neighborhood where she had once played as a child, and I could see in her eyes that she still recognized me, still believed in the man I was. But whenever Julia entered the room, those conversations would end quickly, and the girl's expression would shift into something guarded, as though she feared reprimand. My grandson, less patient, avoided me altogether, his eyes fixed on his phone during dinners, his responses curt, absorbed in a world where grandparents are little more than background noise. The culmination of this escalation came on a Sunday afternoon, when I arrived at their house to find a gathering of neighbors already present, an informal brunch that Julia had organized. I was not told in advance, and as I entered, I realized with a jolt that my presence had been carefully framed. I was introduced not as father or grandfather, but as Dad, who doesn't get out much these days, said with a half-smile that drew knowing looks from the guests. Throughout the meal, Julia dropped comments about how I sometimes forgot appointments, how I preferred to stay at home with my newspaper, how it was such a relief to know that she and Richard could keep an eye on me. The words were delivered lightly, but the effect was heavy, planting seeds in the minds of outsiders, witnesses who might later be asked to confirm that Harold Ellison was indeed slipping. I sat there, my fork heavy in my hand, forcing myself to remain silent, though every muscle in my body screamed to protest, to shout that my mind was as sharp as ever, that the forgetfulness they implied was fiction. But I realized then that my silence was not defeat. It was observation. They were revealing their strategy to me, and though the humiliation burned, I understood that knowledge was my weapon. That evening, alone in my house, I spread out papers across the table. Bank statements, deeds, records of the money I had invested in Richard's home, documents that proved my role was not that of a passive dependent, but of a man whose sacrifices had built the very foundation they now inhabited. I realized with icy clarity that their plan was not merely about convenience or concern. It was about inheritance, about securing control over assets they had come to see as theirs. The narrative of incompetence was a means to an end, and the end was financial. That recognition, bitter though it was, also gave me strength. For while they underestimated me, treating me as though I were already diminished, I was preparing quietly, steadily, to remind them that I had not relinquished my authority. The second escalation, then, was not only theirs, but mine as well. For every whispered accusation, I built a counter-argument. For every humiliation, I sharpened my resolve. And though the road ahead promised conflict more painful than anything I had faced within my own blood, I knew that dignity once surrendered cannot be reclaimed, and so I would not surrender it, not to my son, not to his wife, not to anyone. The breaking point arrived on a night that seemed ordinary at first, though I suppose in hindsight the small details foreshadowed the confrontation that was waiting like a storm behind the calm facade of a family gathering. For when I entered Richard and Julia's house, there was a formality in the air heavier than on previous evenings, a careful arrangement of the table, as if staged for more than just dinner, and an undercurrent in their voices that suggested rehearsal, as though they had decided that this was the night to assert their authority openly rather than continue with subtle hints and private whispers. I had felt the escalation building for weeks, had sensed the way they were maneuvering me toward a corner where silence would equal surrender, and so I had come prepared, not only with my resolve, but with documents folded carefully in the inside pocket of my jacket, proof that I was not the helpless figure they hoped to present, but a man still in possession of memory, clarity, and legal standing. Dinner began with the usual brittle pleasantries, Julia asking if the drive over had been difficult, Richard pouring wine with a smile too tight to be sincere, the grandchildren shifting uncomfortably in their seats as if they already knew what was coming. Conversation stumbled along in fits and starts until Julia, in that practiced tone of concern she used when speaking to me in front of others, remarked that she and Richard had been so worried about me living alone that it wasn't safe anymore, that it might be time to consider a more supportive environment. My fork paused midway to my mouth, but I did not speak. I wanted to hear how far they would push. Richard then leaned forward, his voice steady, rehearsed, announcing that they had already spoken with a facility nearby, a place with excellent staff and medical care, and that he thought it was the best step for everyone. His words landed like a hammer on the table, and in the silence that followed I could hear the clink of Julia's bracelet as she folded her hands, her eyes fixed on me with expectation, the expression of someone waiting for acquiescence. For a long moment I let the silence stretch, because silence has a weight of its own, and then I set my fork down deliberately, pulled the folded documents from my jacket, and placed them on the table in front of me. My voice, when I finally spoke, was calm but firm, carrying the weight of decades of authority that fatherhood had once given me, and that I now reclaimed for myself. I said that I was fully aware of what they were trying to do, that I had heard the whispers, seen the sideways glances, felt the humiliations carefully arranged to portray me as forgetful and incompetent, but that tonight the performance ended. I slid the documents across the table toward Richard, who hesitated before touching them, and I explained in precise detail that the deed to this very house bore my name alongside his and Julia's, that the money I had provided had not been a gift, but an investment, and that legally I was not a guest here, but an owner, equal in standing and authority. The shock on Julia's face was immediate, her mask slipping for the first time, and Richard's jaw tightened as he scanned the papers, his lips moving silently as he read the clauses that bound them to me. The grandchildren stared, their eyes wide, and I felt the tide in the room shift, the narrative they had tried to construct faltering under the weight of undeniable fact. Julia tried to recover, her voice high, accusing me of misunderstanding, of twisting things. But I interrupted her with a steadiness that surprised even me, telling her that I remembered every dollar, every signature, every promise made when this house was purchased, and that if they intended to push me into a corner, I would not retreat. I would force a reckoning. Richard's composure cracked then, anger spilling through the careful mask of concern, and he accused me of being selfish, of clinging to control I no longer deserved, of endangering the family with my obstinacy. His words came fast, heated, the language of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. But I held my ground, repeating calmly that dignity is not a privilege granted by children to their parents, but a right inherent in being alive, and that I would not surrender it simply to make his life more convenient. Julia reached for the grandchildren, as if to pull them into her side of the argument, but my granddaughter, God bless her courage, rose from her chair and walked to me. Placing a hand on my shoulder, her voice quiet but clear as she said, "He's not confused. He knows exactly what he's saying." That small gesture, that moment of solidarity, shattered whatever performance Richard and Julia had hoped to stage, for now the table no longer held one voice against theirs, but two, the narrative of incompetence, broken by the witness of youth. I did not shout, I did not rage, for rage would have given them the evidence they craved. Instead, I stood slowly, my chair scraping back across the floor, and I looked directly at Richard, my son, the boy I had raised, the man who now sought to erase me, and I told him that from this day forward, the terms of our relationship had changed. No longer would I accept the role of guest or dependent. I reminded him that my name was on the deed, that my share of ownership gave me rights not only to the table, but to decisions about the house itself, and that if he wished to challenge me legally, he would find me more prepared than he imagined. The silence that followed was thunderous, broken only by Julia's sharp intake of breath and the nervous shifting of chairs as guests who had come for dinner realized they were witnessing something raw and irreversible. With that, I gathered my papers, tucked them back into my jacket, and walked out of the room with my head high, not waiting for a reply, for none was needed. The climax had come, not in a flurry of raised voices, but in the quiet assertion of truth. And as I stepped into the cold night air, I felt the weight of years lift slightly from my shoulders, replaced not by joy, but by the fierce satisfaction of a man who had refused to vanish quietly into the kitchen, who had claimed once more his rightful place at the head of the table, not only in furniture, but in life itself. The days after that confrontation moved with a different kind of weight, not lighter exactly, but sharper, as though the air itself carried a clarity I had not known in years, because once a man has stood his ground and spoken truth in the face of those who would silence him, he cannot return to the muted role of a bystander in his own life. And though Richard and Julia did not call me in the week that followed, and though I knew that anger simmered in their house like a pot left too long on the stove, I felt no regret, only the steady pulse of conviction that what had been done could not be undone, and what had been spoken could not be unsaid. I moved through my days with an unfamiliar energy, tending the small routines of my solitary life not as a means of passing time, but as acts of ownership, each gesture, brewing coffee, sweeping the porch, polishing my shoes, reminding me that I remained a man capable of choice, of action, of presence. Neighbors began to notice the change in me, commenting that I seemed more upright, more alive, and I realized that even those who barely knew me could see the difference between a man drifting toward invisibility and a man who had reclaimed his shape. I did not boast to them, did not recount the confrontation in detail, for dignity is not measured in the retelling of victories, but in the quiet endurance that follows. Yet I carried the memory like a shield, proof that I had not been erased despite the efforts of those who should have been my protectors. At night, when I sat by the window with the newspaper or with one of Marianne's old novels, I would catch my reflection in the glass and see not a ghost of the man I once was, but the man himself. Older, yes, but unbroken, and that recognition brought a measure of peace, Richard eventually called, his voice subdued, strained, and though he did not apologize outright, pride being a hard wall to dismantle, he spoke with caution, no longer dictating terms but asking, testing the ground as though uncertain of my response. Julia did not speak to me directly, but I could sense her presence in the background of the conversation, her silence heavy with disapproval. The grandchildren, however, reached out in small ways, my granddaughter sending me a message to say she admired my strength, my grandson awkwardly mentioning that he hoped to visit when he was back from school, and these gestures, though modest, reassured me that the seeds of truth had taken root, that not everyone in the family had been blinded by the narrative of my decline. I knew, of course, that the battle was not entirely over, that resentment would linger, that future gatherings would be edged with tension, but I also knew that the line had been drawn permanently, that never again would I allow myself to be pushed into the kitchen like an afterthought. Never again would I yield my place at the table, or in my own life out of fear of disturbing the fragile comfort of others. Marianne's voice seemed close to me in those days, her words echoing in memory, her insistence that a man must hold on to dignity because once surrendered it cannot be retrieved. And I felt as though I had finally honored that promise to her, not only for my own sake, but for the legacy of the family we had built together. The resolution, then, was not in reconciliation, for reconciliation requires both sides to meet in honesty, and I doubted Richard and Julia were capable of such honesty yet. The resolution was in the quiet strength of knowing that I had chosen not to fade, that I had chosen to sit at the head of the table and to remain there, not only in wood and fabric, but in the deeper sense of claiming authority over my final years. I do not know what time remains to me, whether it will be long or short, but I know now that however many days are given, they will not be spent in silent exile in the corner of a kitchen, eating alone while the laughter of others fills the air. I will not vanish politely for their convenience. I will live as myself until the very end, and when that end comes, it will not find me diminished but still standing, still remembered, still my own man.